Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a core theological question within Islam. So, how can one person be a perfect guide, but also a human who makes mistakes? Well, the answer seems to lie in understanding two very distinct roles the Prophet played. On one hand, you have the Nabi, the man. On the other, the Resul, the messenger. Okay, so first up, let's look at Muhammad the man, his role as the Nabi.
The Quran is clear that other prophets also made mistakes. It was a human trait.
Even his closest followers knew when to question his personal judgment versus divine revelation.
So things like cultural customs or personal taste, that's all part of his human side.
Right here you can see him basing a decision on his own observation, not a command from God.
All right, let's switch gears to his other role, Muhammad the messenger, the Resul.
It's kind of like an ambassador. They deliver the official message perfectly, but their personal advice isn't policy.
And the Quran is super clear. Obedience to the Rasul, that is, the message, is absolute.
So the key takeaway, his only job as messenger was delivering the Quran without error.
Okay, and this simple distinction, it completely changes how we can look at Islamic law.
The idea is that only God can actually declare something forbidden or permitted, no one else.
And this quote backs that up. The Prophet points directly to the book as the source for law.
Now this is where it gets really cool. This framework offers a new way to read tricky verses.
So instead of a mystical event, the source points to a scientific one for this promise.
It argues the covenant is a metaphor for our biological programming in the womb. Pretty wild, right?
So what does all this mean for the concept of sunnah, the Prophet's example?
It's less about imitating personal habits and more about living the Quran's core values. Things like forgiveness, kindness, patience, these are the real sunnah from the Quran itself.
This is why companions stopped others from turning his personal habits into religious rituals.
So, if the Quran is the only divine law, what then is the role of tradition?
Welcome to The Explainer. In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is held up as the perfect model for humanity. But he was also, a man living in a specific time and place, making tough calls. So how can he be both a perfect guide and a human being? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating framework from our source material that tries to square that very circle.
And this is really the heart of the puzzle, isn't it? On one hand, you have this idea of an infallible guide, whose example is meant for all people for all time. But on the other hand, historical records show us the person who lived a very human life, who could, in his personal capacity, make judgment calls that could be debated. How do those two things fit together?
This tension has pushed people into two opposite corners. In one corner, you have folks who almost elevate the Prophet to this superhuman, near-divine figure. And in the other corner, you have his original critics back in Mecca who are saying, how can this guy be a prophet? He eats food. He walks around in the market just like us. Our source today says, well, both of those views are actually missing the bigger picture.
So how do we get out of this paradox? The source we're looking at proposes a really critical distinction. It argues that the Prophet Muhammad was essentially wearing two hats at the same time. Understanding the difference between these two roles, Nabi and Resul, is the key to the whole thing. Let's break them down.
All right, first up, we have his role as Nebi, or prophet. You can think of this as his human hat. This covers his personal judgments, his cultural habits, his strategic decisions as a leader. This is the prophet as a general, a husband, a member of his community, a real person, in other words, living in his time and navigating the world with his own wisdom and experience.
And then there's the other hat, Resul, or messenger. This was his divine function. When he was acting as Resul, he was a pure conduit for God's revelation. Think of it like a perfect fiber optic cable, delivering the Quran without any distortion, without any personal opinion mixed in. And in this role, the message was divinely protected and demanded total obedience.
Okay, I know, Nabi, Resul, it can feel a bit abstract. But don't worry, the source gives us a fantastic modern analogy to make it all click. A diplomat. Let's see how this plays out.
This lays it out perfectly. Imagine a diplomat reading an official statement from their government. Those words are non-negotiable, right? That's the state talking. But does that mean you also have to start liking their favorite brand of coffee or wearing the same kind of shoes? Of course not. That's their personal life. The source says this is exactly the same idea. The divine message delivered as Resul is binding. But his personal habits as Nebi? Well, that was just him being human.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's a neat theory, but did anyone actually think this way back then?
Well, according to our source, the answer is a huge yes. In fact, it argues the prophet's own closest companions understood this and acted on it, sometimes in incredibly dramatic fashion.
So let's set the scene. We're at one of the most stressful moments in early Islamic history, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Muslims have traveled all the way to Mecca for pilgrimage, but they get stopped at the gates and are forced into a peace treaty with their enemies, and the terms felt like a total slap in the face.
The mood was just explosive. His followers were furious. They felt let down, and they weren't quiet about it. They went right up to him and challenged his leadership, basically asking, "What happened? You told us we'd be entering the Kaaba, and now we're signing this humiliating deal. What's going on?" They were questioning his human judgment.
And what happens next is just mind-blowing. The prophet gives a direct order to his followers to finish the rituals. He says, "Get up, do the sacrifice, shave your heads," and nothing, just silence. He repeats the command, still nothing. He says it a third time, and not a single person moves. Now think about that. These are his most loyal followers, and they are flat out refusing a direct order. The source says this could only happen for one reason. They understood he was acting as their leader, as Nabi, making a strategic call, not delivering a divine command as Resul.
This is such a human moment. The prophet is clearly upset, so he goes into his tent and asks his wife, Saleme, for advice. Her counsel was simple and brilliant. Don't say another word. Just go out there and do the ritual yourself. So he does. He walks out and starts performing the rites. And only then, when his followers see his determination, do they finally get up and follow his lead. It was never a rebellion against God's messenger. It was a profound disagreement with their leader's strategy.
So what's the big takeaway here? It shows that it was possible to disagree with the prophet's personal judgment. And get this, the source points out that sometimes the companion's instincts were actually right, and a Quranic revelation would later confirm their position. In this particular case, though, the prophet's human strategy turned out to be a stroke of genius. That treaty, which seemed so humiliating at the time, ended up paving the way for a huge victory later on. Okay, so let's bring this into the modern day. What does this idea of two roles mean for how people today should follow the prophet's example, his sunnah? Well, it can change everything. Let's see how. According to this framework, if you don't separate the Nebi from the Resul, you risk falling into a trap. You could end up treating absolutely everything the prophet ever did, the specific clothes he wore, the kind of food he liked, 7th century military tactics, even medical advice from that time, as if it's all sacred, binding religious law for all eternity. The source argues, no, a lot of that was just him living his life as a man of his time. And here is a fantastic, powerful example of this principle in action. Years later, Caliph Omar, one of the Prophet's closest friends, noticed that people were starting to treat the tree from that famous treaty as a holy site. So what did he do? He had it cut down. Why? Because Omar understood the difference. The Prophet resting under a particular tree was a historical event, part of his life as Nebi. It was not a divine ritual to be repeated forever as part of his message as Resul.
Now, this idea of separating the eternal message from its historical container leads our source to a really fascinating, almost sci-fi kind of place. It takes a deeply metaphorical verse from the Quran and connects it to modern biology.
Okay, you're going to want to lean in for this one. There's a Quranic verse that talks about a covenant being taken from the backs of humanity. For centuries, people have read that as a beautiful metaphor. But the source asks, what if it's literally true? It turns out that in modern embryology, the cells that are destined to become our progeny, our descendants, actually first appear high up in an embryo's back, near the spine, before migrating down. The source poses this incredible question. Was the timeless message of the Resul hinting at a biological fact that science wouldn't discover for another 1,400 years? It's a pretty wild thought.
So, whether we're talking about a dramatic historical moment or a detail of biology, it all comes back to this one core idea. Let's wrap things up by focusing on this crucial relationship between the message and the messenger who delivered it.
Our source really emphasizes the absolute purity of the divine message itself. It points to verses in the Quran that say, in some of the strongest language imaginable, that if the messenger had tried to invent even a single word and pass it off as revelation, he would have been stopped, completely and decisively. His job as Resul was to be a perfect delivery system. That's it.
So here's the crucial takeaway from all this. Distinguishing between the prophet as a man, the Nebi, and as a messenger, the Resul, doesn't diminish him.
According to the source, it actually clarifies his real status. It puts a protective barrier around the divine message, keeping it from getting tangled up with human culture or the specifics of history. And it allows us to fully appreciate the prophet's humanity, his struggles, his brilliant leadership, his wisdom in a whole new way. It leaves us with a critical question we have to ask ourselves. When we study his life, are we looking at the timeless message, or are we looking at the incredible man who delivered it?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we believe you don't need a whole library to be well-informed. You just need us. We find the most powerful insights for you.
And today is one of the most intellectually, I think, rigorous deep dives we've ever attempted.
It really is. We are looking at the absolute foundational sources of Islamic law and theology. We're going to be asking some really deep questions about the roles and the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And critically, the binding nature of his traditions.
Exactly.
That's right. The listener who supplied these sources has given us a very focused and highly critical lens for analyzing authority. I'd say our mission here is threefold.
Okay.
First, we have to really dissect the Quranic definitions of Nebi the Prophet and Resul the Messenger.
Got it.
Second, based on those definitions, we have to figure out where the precise locus of divine authority actually lies. And then finally, we'll use that foundation to explore a pretty rigorous critique of Hadith.
The collected sayings and actions of the Prophet.
Exactly. Challenging their reliability, their legislative application, especially when you measure them against the consistency of the Quran itself.
And this isn't, just some academic exercise. The argument here, as it's laid out in the source material, it's about the very core structure of obedience, of law, of theology.
It is.
If we get these definitions wrong, if we sort of blur the lines between the prophet's human role, the Nebi, and his divine function as the result,
then you can end up in a very different place.
Drastically different. And the sources argue flawed conclusions about religious law, personal conduct, and maybe most importantly, the avoidance of shirk.
Absolutely. The source material basically suggests that this one misunderstanding, this specific distinction, is the root cause of so many historical, legal problems and discrepancies. It all starts with getting the terminology right.
We have to be precise.
If we aren't, the whole argument just, falls apart.
Okay, so let's start right there. In everyday language, I think for most people, prophet and messenger are pretty much interchangeable.
They are, yeah.
But these sources are insisting that they are functionally different roles, that the Quran itself defines them differently.
So what's the foundational terminology we need to get our heads around?
Okay, so we have to think of Nebi and Resul as two different dimensions of a single person. According to this analysis, Nebi is an unvan. It's a title.
A title.
Bestowed by God. It signifies, the person who receives the revelation, the honored human who's been chosen to hear God's word. But Resul, that's a gurev, a duty.
A job.
It's a job. It literally translates to the one who brings or conveys the message. The title, the Nebi, is personal. The duty, the Resul, is functional. It's directional.
Okay, so if Nebi is the title, Resul is the job description. How does that work in practice? What's the relationship?
The best analogy the source uses is from international relations. Think of the Nebi as the diplomat. That's their honored status, their title.
But the Resul is the ambassador, the envoy. That's the specific high-stakes duty of transmitting the sovereign's binding commands and law to, a foreign land. A diplomat who doesn't actually convey the message isn't doing their primary job.
Yeah. And the sources are arguing that all prophets are, in fact, messengers.
Precisely. The argument is that every single recipient of revelation, every Nebi, is compelled to convey that revelation. They have to. And so they act as a result.
You can't just receive a divine message and keep it to yourself.
You can't.
Yeah.
So every Nebi must also be a result because they're given a message or a book and they are obligated to communicate it. The Nebiship is sort of the prerequisite status for the Risalet, the message delivery duty.
Now, this is where it really starts to challenge a more traditional view, right? One that sometimes separates the two based on whether the prophet got a whole new book of scripture.
It does.
Does the Quran itself actually support this unity you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. And the sources provide some really powerful textual evidence against that traditional separation. If you look at figures who we strongly associate with specific scriptures, they're still called by both titles. Take Musa, Moses, we think Torah, right? But in Surah Maryam, verse 51, he's explicitly called a Nebi Resul. Both.
Okay, that seems pretty definitive. What about someone who maybe didn't receive a whole separate book?
Great question. Look at Ismail. The traditional view doesn't usually credit him with a separate scripture, but in Maryam 54, he's also called a Nebi Resul. Same thing with Isa, with Jesus. He's called God's Resul all over the place, and also a Nebi.
So the pattern holds.
It's consistent across the text. Figures like Lut, Saleh, Hud, Nu. They're all consistently called Rasuls in the Quran, even if secondary literature classifies them differently.
So this core function, the Risalah, the message delivery, it's universal. And when we look at the Prophet Muhammad, how is this duality confirmed for him?
In Surah Azab, verse 40, he's confirmed as both the messenger of God, Allah and Rasulu, and the seal of the prophets, Nebilerin Sunumkusu. The text argues this duality isn't just a historical accident, it's a functional necessity. The core message being delivered, the revelation, the wahi, that is what defines the duty of the Rasul.
Okay, so here it is. This is the pivot point for everything else we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Where does the listener, where do you direct your obedience? If the Nebi is the person and the Rasul is the function, who do we obey?
Obedience, itat, and following, itiba, they are only directed toward the Rasul.
Only.
This is the central pillar of the entire argument. When the Quran says over and over again, obey Allah and his Rasul, it's the Rasul acting as the channel for divine law.
I see.
Even the command to follow the Prophet in Ali Imran, say, if you love Allah, then follow me, is immediately followed by a verse commanding obedience to Allah and his Rasul. They're inextricably linked.
But why is this distinction so absolutely critical for obedience?
Because if you obey the Nebi indiscriminately, that is, the human being, in his personal capacity, with his personal judgments, his cultural opinions, his advice in the moment, you risk elevating a human opinion to the level of divine law.
You'd be binding the entire community to something that was maybe just for that specific time and place.
Exactly. Obedience has to be directed to the message and the one delivering the message, the Rasul, because the message is the only thing guaranteed to be divine, eternal, and universal. This distinction is what protects the sanctity of God's law. It prevents human error from creeping into divine legislation.
That is a fundamental theological structure. It implies that anything the prophet did outside of conveying direct revelation has to be treated differently. It's advice, it's guidance, personal judgment, but not mandatory binding law.
Exactly. And if this Nebi Rasul distinction is theologically sound, then we have to find evidence. We need to find it in the Quran, in historical accounts, where the prophet's authority, when he's acting just as the Nebi, the human being,
Was limited.
was demonstrably limited or even, subject to being reversed. And our sources give us some very specific, very high-stakes examples of this.
Okay, let's start with the clearest textual evidence. The difference in consequence for offending the prophet. It's in Surah Azab. Why is the penalty so drastically different between verses 53 and 57?
The difference is it's striking, and it really proves the functional separation. Azab 53 deals with people who might incite or offend the Nebi.
Okay, the Nebi.
And the context of the verse, it's all about social etiquette. Lingering too long in his house after a meal, invading his privacy, causing him personal distress. The verse strongly discourages this. It says it causes the prophet grief.
What?
But it mentions no divine curse, no threat of hellfire, no specific worldly punishment. It's an etiquette violation. It concerns his human personhood.
But then just 4 verses later, the stakes become eternal.
Azab 57. It addresses those who offend Allah and his Rasul.
The Resul.
And the consequence is immediate and enormous. God curses them in this world and the next and promises a humiliating punishment. The source really emphasizes this enormous difference in the penalty.
Because if they were functionally the same?
The penalty would be the same.
Oh.
The fact that offending the Rasul brings on God's eternal curse proves that this offense isn't just a personal insult, it's a rejection of the Risalah.
The message.
Which is the message, the divine law. It's defiance against God himself.
Okay, that clarifies the theological boundary. Now let's apply it to a real-world case, something that must have caused a huge social discussion at the time. The Zeed incident in Azab 37. Can you walk us through that narrative and why it's such a key case study in non-binding advice?
The Zeed incident is a perfect illustration of the limits of the Nebi's personal judgment, his ijtihad. Zeed was the prophet's adopted son, which was a very sensitive social issue back then. When he wanted to divorce his wife, the prophet, acting as a compassionate human advisor.
As the
Nebi, he told him, fear God and keep your wife. This was a maruf command. It was good, sound, recommended advice meant to solve a marriage conflict.
So the prophet, as this respected leader and foster father, gave him advice rooted in good conduct. What happened when Zayd decided to ignore that advice?
Zayd went ahead with the divorce. Now, here's the absolute crucial point for our analysis. Zayd was not condemned by God. He wasn't publicly chastised by the prophet. The companions didn't shun him for disobeying the prophet's direct advice.
And the source argues the reason for that is?
It's self-evident. The Quran did not have a verse prohibiting divorce in that situation. Since there was no revealed law, no wahi that made the prophet's advice mandatory, Zayd was free to follow his own judgment.
That is profound. It shows that a command from the prophet, even when it was clearly good advice, maruf, it didn't automatically become binding law unless it was backed by the Rasul's mandate by the Quran.
It relieves him of the impossible burden of human infallibility. It affirms he was God's chosen messenger, but still a human advisor.
And this whole framework is reinforced by how the companions, the Ashab, actually behaved. Did they treat the prophet's every word, every strategic decision as absolute law? The sources here suggest the complete opposite. Robust disagreement was actually common.
Absolutely. The behavior of the companions is a key part of this source material's argument. They understood the difference between iktihat, personal judgment, and wahi, revelation.
Okay, so let's look at the bi'at condition, the Pledge of Allegiance.
Mumtihan 12. It details the pledge, the bi'at, taken by believing women. They promised not to disobey the Nebi only in maruf.
Only in good things.
The phrase in maruf, in legitimate and good matters, that's the filter. If obedience were absolute, totally unconditional, that phrase only in maruf would be meaningless.
It implies that he could issue a command that wasn't maruf.
Exactly. A command based on personal judgment that might not be suitable or necessary or divinely sanctioned, and in that case, it wouldn't be binding.
Okay, now bring us into the really high-tension situations, the battlefield. The disputes over war strategy at Uhud and Khandaq are classic examples of people challenging the leader.
The tension at Uhud was, you can feel it. The prophet initially wanted a defensive strategy to fight inside the walls of Medina, but a big majority of the younger, more zealous companions, they insisted on marching out to meet the enemy. They argued that staying inside would look like weakness.
And what happened?
The prophet ultimately deferred to the majority. He went with their consensus despite his own personal strategic preference.
So his personal preference as a military leader and the Nebi was overridden by the community's collective judgment.
Precisely. But the Khandaq incident is even more dramatic. It directly addresses this Nebi-Rasul boundary. Medina was under siege. The situation was desperate. To try and lift the siege, the prophet, in a desperate tactical move, offered the leaders of one of the attacking tribes a third of Medina's entire annual date harvest.
Wow. That's a huge political compromise. How does the companions react to that?
Companions like Sa'd bin Mu'az and Sa'd bin Ubaid were furious. They demanded clarification. They famously asked, Ya Rasulullah, is this a command from God or is this your personal view, your iktihat?
They drew the line right there.
And then they followed up with this defiant statement. If this is not God's command, we will give them nothing but the sword.
The stakes were literally life and death, and they felt confident enough to push back because they sensed the command didn't have the weight of revelation.
Their resistance forced the prophet to confirm he was acting on his own initiative. And because it was iktihat, not wahi, the companions felt totally justified in rejecting it. The prophet withdrew the offer. This is powerful, powerful evidence. The community accepted the right to question and potentially reject commands that didn't have divine sanction.
Then there's the really contentious Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where Omar strongly protested what he saw as humiliating terms.
Omar was devastated. He openly questioned the prophet's judgment. He asked if he was truly the Nebi of God, given how unfavorable the terms were, like having to return new converts back to Mecca. The dispute got so severe that the prophet had to explicitly declare, I am the Resul of God and I will not disobey him. At that moment, he wasn't relying on his title, the Nebi, or his wisdom. He was relying on the fact that the entire action was mandated by wahi.
So the synthesis of all these disputes is crystal clear. The companions consistently tested the source of the authority. Was it human advice or was it a divine command?
Yes. They believed the prophet was human, that he was capable of errors in judgment, in iktihat, and they held that the only absolutely binding authority was the revelation. Sometimes the prophet's judgment proved to be right in the long run, like at Hudaybiyah.
Which led to the conquest of Mecca.
Right, and sometimes the companions were right, like at Khandaq. This constant dynamic proves that absolute, unquestioning obedience was reserved only for the Risalet, the message of the Resul.
Okay, so if the core law is solely the Quran, as transmitted by the Resul, then we have to talk about the status of Hadith. The source material presents a really serious structural critique of Hadith collections as a source for legislation. Let's get into that.
This critique makes a very sharp distinction between Sunnah and Hadith. The binding Sunnah, it's defined here as the Prophet's universally accepted continuous practice that is indisputably rooted in the Quran itself.
Things like the basic forms of prayer, fasting, Hajj.
Exactly. The argument is that Hadith reports, especially what are called ahad reports, cannot constitute this binding Sunnah.
Okay, let's slow down here and define those terms for everyone listening. What's the difference between a mutawatir and an ahad hadith?
Right. So Hadith are accounts of the Prophet's sayings or actions. They get classified based on their chain of transmission. Mutawatir means consecutive or universally transmitted. It's a report that's been passed down by so many reliable people in so many separate chains that it's basically impossible for them all to have conspired to lie. It gives you near certainty.
And ahad?
Ahad means single chain or isolated. These are reports transmitted by just one or a few individuals in the early generations. Now, the individuals might be totally trustworthy, but the possibility of human error, misremembering, losing the context, a simple mistake, is much, much higher.
So the sources argue the core sunnah has to be mutawatir.
It has to be, because it must be perfectly preserved. But the vast majority of legal hadith that are used today fall into that ahad category, which makes them, in this view, an insufficient foundation for defining binding universal law.
And the Prophet's own actions regarding documentation, or lack thereof, seem to undermine the idea that these personal reports were meant to be legislative texts for all time.
This is a huge structural argument. In the Quran, Islam places an incredible emphasis on documentation, on writing things down for preservation. The very first revelation begins with the command read, and it refers to the pen. Crucially, the longest verse in the whole Quran, the debt verse.
Baqarah 282.
It mandates the meticulous writing and witnessing of every single debt, no matter how small, just to prevent future disputes.
So if writing down a small temporary loan is mandated with that much rigor,
then you would think the writing and preservation of divine laws meant to govern the entire community forever would have been mandated with far greater rigor. But, the sources argue, the Prophet actually discouraged, and in some cases even forbade, the writing of his personal sayings and non-Quranic judgments.
the conclusion is inescapable then.
The logical conclusion here is that if hadith were necessary for the faith, if they were intended as legislative texts for the Ummah, the Prophet would have ordered them to be meticulously written down and preserved. Since he didn't, it strongly suggests they were meant as temporary, historical, or cultural accounts, not as binding law on par with the Quran.
And this connects directly to a pretty severe theological warning in the Quran itself about baseless hadiths. What's this condemnation of level hadiths?
A level hadith gets translated as baseless hadiths, or vain talk. The source cites several verses that condemn people who actively choose this vain talk over God's clear guidance in the Quran. The critique here is piercing. It says this condemnation applies directly to those who insist on following a hadith report that clearly and unambiguously contradicts the Quran.
So what happens when they prioritize that human report?
By prioritizing the human report over the divine revelation, they are committing the very act described in the verses, turning away in arrogance, as if they never heard it. They are placing a human transmission above the authority of the Creator. This, the sources argue, is getting dangerously close to shirk associating a secondary authority with the singular absolute authority of God in matters of law.
Before we move on to the legal side of things, let's touch on the Prophet's personal capacity again. There's the traditional view that the Prophet was illiterate Ummi. How does the source challenge this, and why is that important for this whole discussion?
The traditional view is that Ummi means illiterate. The source presents a really compelling reinterpretation. It argues that in the context of the Quran, Ummi means the Prophet was not from the people of the book.
He wasn't Jewish or Christian.
Right. And so he had no prior access to their written scriptures. This interpretation is vital because it confirms the absolute originality and purity of the Quran. It prevents critics from claiming he just copied ancient texts.
And what's the direct evidence the source uses to counter the idea of illiteracy?
The most compelling evidence comes from the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. When the Meccans objected to the title Allah's Resul on the treaty document, the Prophet himself personally erased the phrase and wrote the replacement phrase, Muhammad bin Abdullah, with his own hands.
He wrote it himself.
Yes. Furthermore, the source argues illiteracy is just contrary to logic, given his background. He managed huge trade caravans traveling to complex commercial centers like Damascus. He would have had to manage accounts, inventories, contracts.
So if he was literate and capable of writing, his decision not to mandate the writing of his personal hadith carries even more weight. It was a conscious choice to prioritize the Quran.
Absolutely. It completely removes the argument that he couldn't have written them down or that he was incapable of setting up a system for it. His lack of a mandate was deliberate.
Okay, let's pivot to the related issue of miracles. The source argues the only lasting universal miracle is the Quran itself. How does that position force the rejection of certain popular hadith, specifically the one about the prophet being affected by magic?
Right. The source holds that the prophet's divine credential, his barat, is the Quran. It's a verifiable universal text accessible to every generation. And this very strict stance requires rejecting hadith narratives that claim the prophet was afflicted by magic or buyu, by a Jewish sorcerer.
And why must this specific hadith be rejected?
The critique is two-pronged: theological and chronological. Theologically, the Quran explicitly defends the prophet from his critics who claimed he was bewitched or a madman. If you accept the hadith, you have to accept that the Quran's defense was either wrong or that the prophet's divine protection failed.
And the chronological problem?
It's severe. The hadith claims that the two final chapters of the Quran, Filak and Nas, were revealed specifically to cure this magic, which supposedly happened in Medina. But the source asserts these chapters were revealed much, much earlier, during the Meccan period. This makes the whole narrative contextually impossible.
So if a hadith contradicts both the prophet's divine defense and clear chronology, it has to be discarded in favor of the revelation.
That's the principle. This level of skepticism, insisting on holding traditions accountable to the Quran, it sets the stage perfectly for examining how the legal schools, the fiqh, developed their rulings.
This is where we see the rubber meet the road. The critique argues that the failure to apply this strict Nebi Resul filter led to legal rulings that directly contradict the Quran's clear text.
And it often happened by elevating an ahad hadith, a single chain report, over the revealed word.
Okay, we need to set the historical context. Who was Abu Hanif, and why is his approach to hadith so central to this whole discussion?
Abu Hanifa founded the Hanafi school, one of the four main Sunni schools of law. He lived only 2 generations after the Prophet. His school is famous for its emphasis on reason, consistency, deduction. It often placed a much greater burden of proof on hadith than other schools did. The source material presents Abu Hanifa as this towering figure who fiercely defended Quranic consistency.
And what was his central, non-negotiable principle when it came to the Prophet's potential rulings?
His core conviction was that the Prophet never contradicted God's book. This was not up for debate. Abu Hanifa would reject any hadith that introduced a new ruling, a hukum, that wasn't in the Quran, or one that contradicted an existing ruling.
And he based this on what?
Not just abstract loyalty, he based it on the severe warning in Surah Haqqa.
Right, that's the dramatic passage about the Prophet's life being on the line if he fabricated a ruling.
Exactly. Haqqa 44:47 states, and it's terrifying, if he, the messenger, had fabricated against us some of the sayings, we would have seized him by the right hand, then cut off his jugular vein. Wow. For Abu Hanif, this verse was confirmation. The Prophet was divinely prevented from creating new, contradictory, or unauthorized laws. So if a hadith introduced a new hukum, it was, by definition, unreliable. Because if the Prophet had tried to make up a law, he would have been struck dead. This was his ultimate consistency filter.
But the source claims that later Hanafi jurists, they drifted away from this strict standard. Let's look at the first case study. Atonement for breaking the fast, or Rus Kifredi. What's the traditional Hanafi ruling based on hadith?
The standard Hanafi position, which comes from a famous hadith from Abu Hurairah, mandates a staggering penalty for breaking a Ramadan fast with intercourse. The offender has to fast for 60 consecutive days or feed 60 poor people and still make up the one day they missed. That's 61 days total. It's a very severe non-Quranic punishment.
Hold on. If the Quran is the source of law, what does the Quran itself say about breaking a fast, say because of a mistake or illness?
The Quran prescribes simple qaza, just making up the missed days later, or fidya, feeding a poor person if you can't fast. It doesn't prescribe a 60-day consecutive penalty for this particular offense. The source argues this severe penalty is actually a case of narrative error, a context loss in the hadith chain.
How does the source try to prove the context was lost?
By analyzing a more detailed version of the same incident found in other sources like the Musnad, which is narrated by the actual man involved. This detailed version reveals the man was actually asking about the atonement for zihar.
We had to define zihar clearly here.
Right. Zihar was a pre-Islamic custom. A husband would equate his wife to his mother, basically saying she's forbidden to him without actually divorcing her. The Quran condemns this and provides a very strict atonement for it. First, free a slave. If you can't, fast for 2 straight months, 60 days. If you can't do that, feed 60 poor people.
That sequence sounds familiar.
It's the exact same sequence. The punishment prescribed in that fast-breaking hadith from Abu Hurairah, free a slave, fast 60 days, feed 60 poor, it perfectly matches the Quranic atonement for zihar.
So the claim is?
The claim is that the narrator, Abu Hurairah, missed or omitted the context of the original question, which was about zihar. And later jurists, focusing only on the phrase, I broke the fast, mistakenly applied the severe zihar penalty to a simple fasting violation.
That is an astonishing implication. It means a cornerstone ruling in one of the major legal schools could be founded on a narrator just missing the original context of the question.
It highlights the extreme danger of relying on these single-chain reports that aren't cross-referenced with the definitive structure of the Quran. If Abu Hanif's strict rule had been consistently applied, this new penalty isn't in the Quran, so the hadith must be misapplied. This legal error might never have been institutionalized.
Okay, now let's tackle the second, even more severe legal discrepancy. The penalty for adultery, zina hadi. This involves the difference between lashes and, well, death.
This is maybe the most critical divergence from the Quran. Surah Nur, verse 2, gives the clear, explicit punishment for unlawful sexual intercourse, zina. It mandates 100 lashes for both the female offender and the male offender. And crucially, the verse makes no distinction based on marital status.
But traditional Hanafi sources, relying on Hadith, prescribe a very different penalty for married individuals for a musan.
They do. Relying on Hadith traditions, they prescribe death by stoning, rekamim, for the married offender, and they reserve the 100 lashes for the unmarried. The source argues that this completely replaces the Quran's fixed, non-lethal physical penalty with capital punishment. It creates a direct, irreconcilable contradiction.
If Abu Hanif was so strict about Quranic consistency, how could this stoning ruling have ever emerged in the tradition that bears his name?
The source argues that Abu Hanif himself would have rejected the stoning hadith precisely because it contradicts the Quran. We know he was willing to reject hadith. He specifically argued against a hadith which claimed an adulterer automatically loses their faith. He used a single word from the Quran, minkum, from among you, to affirm that adulterers remain believers.
So his level of scrutiny was that fine-grained.
Exactly. If he fought tooth and nail to preserve the religious status of the offender based on one word in the Quran, it's logical to conclude he would have rejected a tradition that fundamentally altered the prescribed physical penalty from 100 lashes to death.
So we're talking about a historical process, where later followers prioritized the Hadith collection methods of Abu Hanif's critics over his own foundational principle of Quranic consistency.
And it led to immense and possibly erroneous legal consequences. That is the core conclusion. The Prophet, as the Resul, delivered the definitive law, 100 lashes. Later jurisprudence, by elevating single-chain reports that suggested stoning, allowed the human element, the Hadith tradition, to supersede the divine word. It committed the very error that Abu Hanif's system was designed to prevent.
We've built a powerful case for Quranic primacy. Now let's zoom out to the broader theological context. This source material emphasizes that this strict view of authority isn't about making Islam new. It's about recognizing the continuity of divine law and safeguarding Tawhid.
Correct. The concept of Tawhid, absolute monotheism, is like the protective membrane over all of these arguments. But first, let's look at continuity through Surah Shura, verse 13.
What does that verse establish about the law given to previous prophets?
It asserts that God revealed the same core principles and law, the Sharia, to all the results. Nuh, Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, and Muhammad. The message is continuous. It's identical in its fundamentals.
Which means that the core acts of worship prayer, Hajj, fasting, zakat, weren't invented from scratch for the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly. He was already practicing acts of worship even before the specific Quranic verses detailing them were revealed.
How is that possible?
He was practicing the established sunnat of the previous Rasuls and the Hanif community in Mecca. Islam didn't just arrive in a religious vacuum. Acts like Hajj, namaz, and fasting were known, but they had become polluted with polytheistic elements. The Quran's role was to purify these practices, clarify them, and confirm the right way to do them, returning them to the pure law shared by all the prophets.
That continuity is important.
It's very important because it prevents the idea that the Prophet Muhammad was just starting from zero and creating new laws based on his own cultural context. His role was to convey and implement the eternal, purified law of God.
Okay, moving to another high-impact interpretive debate. The Maqam Mahmud, the praised station, mentioned in Isra 79. Traditionally, this is seen as the prophet's unique authority to intercede, shafa'at, on the Day of Judgment. Why does the source reject this traditional interpretation?
The source argues that the traditional interpretation elevates the prophet to a unique, almost divine spiritual station. That, well, it dangerously flirts with shirk. It risks turning him into an intermediary who can alter God's judgment based on favoritism.
So how does the source provide a different context-based interpretation?
It insists on reading Isra 79 in light of all the surrounding verses. This whole section discusses the prophet's suffering in Mecca, the attempts by critics to sway him, and God's promise of protection. It's in this context of persecution and migration planning that Maqam Mahmud is introduced, right alongside the command for night prayers, Tahajjud.
So what does it refer to then?
The source concludes that Maqam Mahmud doesn't refer to a celestial intercession. It refers to the praised place of safe migration, Medina.
Ah, a physical place.
Yes. The prophet's persistent devotion and night prayers would ensure his success in reaching the safe, praised location. And this interpretation is powerfully supported by the prophet's own prayer found in the very next verse, Isra 80. My Lord, let my entrance to Medina be honest and sincere, and let my exit from Mecca be honest and sincere.
That reframes the entire mission. And the key argument against the traditional view is that the path to the station, the night prayer, isn't exclusive to him.
Exactly. Night prayer is performed by righteous people of the book, by Muslims today. If performing a non-exclusive act of worship leads to an exclusive, unique station of intercession, the logic just fails. Therefore, the station must be the unique, praised achievement of establishing the Muslim community safely in Medina.
This all loops back to the one great danger this entire body source material is designed to combat: shirk, associating partners with God. How does shirk manifest, especially when it comes to authority?
Shirk is the one unforgivable sin, and it rarely shows up as outright denial of God. Historically, polytheists, the mushriks, they believed in God, but they sought intermediaries to get closer to him.
And who are the most common intermediaries?
The Quran identifies them very clearly. Prophets, angels, and religious leaders. They get elevated because of their perceived piety or their proximity to the divine. When people take the words of these figures, even if it's the prophet himself or a beloved scholar, and they grant those words legislative authority equal to God's direct word, they are committing shirk in legislation. They're making a human partner in authority.
And the prophet himself warned against this.
Explicitly. He told people to call him only God's servant and messenger. Alan kulu ve Resulu. Why? To avoid the excessive praise, the ashuru avgu, that had led previous nations to divinize their figures. Christians with Jesus, Jews with Uzier or Ezra, they treated their words as gospel, even when those words deviated from revelation.
So the contemporary danger is institutionalizing human opinion alongside divine law. If you use a hadith to override the Quran, you risk this ultimate error.
It's granting the power of legislation, which belongs only to God, to a human tradition. The source cites the prophet, saying that supplication, dua, is a form of worship, ibadat, warning against invoking other names alongside God in prayer. The same principle applies to authority. Legislating is a form of worship, and that power cannot be shared.
Finally, we have this incredibly intriguing discussion about the primordial covenant, the Misak, from RF 172. It's linked to biological and anatomical facts.
Yeah.
How does this cement the idea that knowledge of God is just intrinsic to us?
The Misak is the moment where God asks humanity, "Am I not your Lord?" And humanity replies, "Yes, we bear witness." The traditional interpretation places this in some metaphorical pre-existence realm. The source, however, argues that the Quran explicitly places this covenant in the womb.
In the womb. What's the tag?
The Quran says the covenant was taken when the zuriyat, the gonads, or reproductive material, migrated from the backspine of the progeny of Adam. The source connects this to modern medical observation. Medical science shows that this migration of reproductive material in the human fetus happens around the 15th fetal week.
That's incredibly specific.
It is, because that timing aligns precisely with the moment the ruh, the spirit or breath of life, is breathed into the fetus, as described in Surah Sekte.
So what's the ultimate implication of this anatomical interpretation?
The knowledge of God, Tawhid, is genetically programmed, Fitratan, into every single human being, and it activates fully at puberty. This intrinsic, innate knowledge means every person is inherently responsible for seeking and recognizing God, regardless of whether a messenger ever reached them in their life.
It's a genetic testimony.
A genetic testimony that prevents excuses on the day of judgment. You can't claim ignorance because the testimony, yes, we bear witness, was taken and witnessed by your own being when you were formed in the womb.
That conclusion provides a complete theological anchor. The Quran is the final, purified law, confirming a truth that is literally written into the fabric of our being.
It emphasizes the sufficiency of the Quran. If the deepest truth is intrinsic, then the external law has to be clear, singular, and unambiguous. It reinforces the need to filter all secondary sources rigorously against the primary, preserved revelation.
This deep dive has been an extraordinary exercise in redefining authority, really, moving beyond surface-level readings to interrogate the foundational roles of the prophet.
We've established that critical functional difference between the prophet as a human advisor, the Nebi, and as the conduit of divine law, the Resul. We used historical flashpoints like the Kandak dispute and the Zayd incident to prove that only the Rasul's function carried binding authority.
While the Nebi's personal judgments were subject to scrutiny and even potential rejection by his own companions.
Right, and then we applied that framework to the critique of Hadith, pointing out the severe legal and theological consequences of adopting single-chain reports that contradict a clear Quranic mandate.
Especially in cases like the zina punishment, or that confusion over the fasting atonement. The historical tension shown by Abu Hanif's strict consistency rule, it shows this struggle isn't new, it's an institutional challenge as old as jurisprudence itself.
The ultimate takeaway here is that vigilance against shirk requires holding all traditions, prophetic, scholarly, cultural, accountable to the Quran. Authority is singular, and when a human report is elevated to supersede or contradict the divine word, we risk replicating the very errors of history that the prophets were sent to correct.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If influential early scholars like Abu Hanif were willing to risk theological controversy by fiercely rejecting hadith that contradicted the Quran, based on the conviction that the prophet could never violate God's definitive book, what responsibility does this place on contemporary jurists and believers to constantly reassess traditional legal rulings, like stoning or the 61-day fast penalty, when they appear to diverge so radically from the plain text of the Quran? This highlights the continuous tension between scholarly integrity and the inertia of institutionalized tradition. Thank you for supplying the sources that made this deep dive possible. We hope this exploration helps clarify your understanding of authority and consistency within divine law.
Welcome back. Today we're digging into a submission that offers a really rigorous Quran-centric critique of traditional sources.
It really is. It argues that legal authority rests only with the prophet's role as Resul, the messenger, by distinguishing it from his role as Nebi, the person.
A very sophisticated piece. And because the topic is so foundational and, sensitive, our focus here is really on the rhetorical strategy. We want to make the core thesis as strong and as accepted as possible.
Right. The logic is there. The question is how to get the reader on board without triggering their defenses.
So let's start with that central framework. I think the material's main engine is this crucial functional distinction between Nebi and Resul.
Yes, it establishes very compellingly that obedience is owed to the Resul, so the message, and not necessarily the Nebi, the human individual.
And it does that by using these binary oppositions, like contrasting the warning against annoying the Nebi in Ahzab 53 with the much more severe curse for those who go against the Resul in Ahzab 57.
Exactly. And while that contrast is logically sound, that's also where the rhetorical weakness creeps in.
How so?
Well, by constantly presenting the prophet's roles as these two separate things, you risk creating a kind of cognitive dissonance. For the reader, spiritually and historically, Muhammad is one single unified person. And if the text feels like it's, fracturing him, they might just instinctively resist the whole idea.
Right, they put up a defensive wall so the logic could be perfect, but the reader rejects it on an emotional level because it feels like it's tearing the prophet in two.
That's the danger. So the suggestion is to manage that tension proactively.
You need to explicitly acknowledge the unity of the person, Muhammad, while you're explaining the functional separation of the roles.
So validate the reader's holistic view first, before you ask them to make the analytical distinction.
Precisely. And a really concrete way to do that would be to introduce a strong framing metaphor right at the start.
Okay.
The piece already has that diplomat elchi analogy, which is good, but it needs to be stressed more. You could say, imagine a diplomat. It's one person, right?
Right, one individual.
But in one moment, they're presenting a binding decree from their state. That's the Resul function. It's absolute. In the next moment, they're just offering a personal opinion on the weather. That's the Nebi function.
I see. So person isn't split, but their function is. It gives the reader a tool to hold both ideas at once.
Exactly. And then, when you get to those verses, Azab 53 and 57, group them together, synthesize them. Explain that one is about causing human hurt, which is bad, but the other is about denying the divine message itself, which has a completely different level of consequence.
So you're not separating the prophet, you're just clarifying the different functions that the Quran itself points out.
Yes, it becomes an explanation, not an attack.
That's a much stronger rhetorical position. Okay, so now that we've secured that front, let's talk about the historical evidence, because there's some incredible stuff in here.
Oh, definitely. The best part, for me, is the use of historical incidents where the companions, the Ashab, actually challenged the prophet.
You mean the non-Resul directives?
Exactly. Like the strategy at Uhud, or the treaty negotiations at Handak, and especially the arguments during the Hudaybiyah negotiations.
Yeah, those are powerful, practical examples showing that absolute, unquestioning obedience wasn't always the rule.
They're academic gold. They're empirical proof that the earliest community understood this distinction. But here's the issue. They're scattered. They're sort of buried in later sections as secondary evidence.
Right, they feel like afterthoughts when they should be the main event.
By the time the reader gets to them, they might have already decided the thesis is too radical.
That's the risk.
So the suggestion is to consolidate these examples. Create a dedicated, high-impact case study right at the beginning. Call it something like the Ashab's practice of critical engagement.
You'd lead with the challenge? Isn't that a bit antagonistic?
I don't think so, because it's internal critique. This isn't an enemy. This is his closest circle. It reframes it from disobedience to discernment.
I see.
And you should absolutely use the Hudaybiyah agreement as the pivotal example. That moment is just explosive. You have someone like Umar, openly questioning him. Are we not the prophet of God?
Exactly.
He's asking these questions loaded with frustration. Why are we accepting this humiliation? The fact that this was even allowed to happen tells you everything you need to know about the expectation of blind obedience.
It shows that discernment was part of the culture. Okay, what other example would you pull forward?
The Handak War negotiation is maybe even clearer. You know, when the prophet considered giving away a third of the city's date harvest to the Ghatafan tribes.
And the Ashab objected.
They did, and it's how they objected that's so important. Sa'd bin Mu'az and Sa'd bin Ubadah stood up, and you should quote them directly.
Their question was basically, is this a command from God or is this your personal strategy?
Yes, they said, and I'm paraphrasing the translation, if this is just something you're doing for our benefit, a personal opinion, then we don't need it. That is a perfect real-world application of the Nabi-Resul distinction, coming from the companions themselves.
Wow. Yeah, moving that to the front changes everything. The theological argument isn't an abstraction anymore. It's a lived reality from day one.
It becomes undeniable. Which brings us to the third and final point, which is about making all of this really practical for the reader today.
Right, moving beyond the historical and theological into the everyday. The material does touch on this with things outside of divine law.
It does, and it has some excellent insights. The sections on Tib Nebavi or prophetic medicine and the agricultural advice, they're great.
The example of the palm pollination advice, for instance?
Or the observation about Gaila, nursing mothers. These are perfect examples of him acting based on human experience, not divine command. But again, the weakness is that these points come really late. They feel like a postscript.
So the reader has to do the work of figuring out the general principle themselves.
Exactly. The material should give them a tool. So the suggestion is to formalize these examples into a major analytical category. Give the reader a practical litmus test.
A litmus test, I like that. A simple way to distinguish binding law from human counsel.
Yes,
Elevate the idea that actions are only binding if they are from the Resul, the revelation, and not the Nebi, the human. That should be a core principle, maybe even its own chapter.
So how do you do that effectively?
You have to start with the prophet's own words. Center that entire section around his statement from the palm pollination incident. It's the definitive principle, straight from the source.
Let's state it, because it's just so critical.
Of course, he said, I am but a human. If I command you something pertaining to your religion, then take it. But if I command you something based on my own opinion, then after all, I am only human. You know your worldly affairs better than I do.
That quote is the whole argument in a nutshell. It empowers the reader immediately.
It does. And then you use the other incidents, like the Gila case, to illustrate it. The prophet first advised against something, then he saw empirical evidence from the Romans and Persians that it wasn't harmful, and he revised his advice.
So his worldly counsel was open to empirical challenge. It wasn't fixed divine law.
Exactly. By giving the reader this litmus test early on, you give them a powerful practical tool for how to approach all of the sources. It makes the entire project not just an academic exercise, but something transformative.
This is really strong feedback. So just to summarize for the listener, the submission is already at a very high level. The scholarship is sound, but there are 3 key opportunities to make it even more impactful.
Right. First, enhance the rhetorical strategy. Add that synthesis section right at the start. Use the diplomat analogy to explain the unity of the prophet's person versus the separation of his roles. It just preempts so much resistance.
Second, restructure the historical evidence. Bring those incredible case studies, Hudaybiyah, Hendik, right to the front. Make them the foundation of the argument, not just supporting details.
And finally, elevate that discussion on worldly matters. Generalize it into a practical litmus test for the reader, anchored by that definitive quote about palm pollination.
Make those changes, and this piece goes from being merely persuasive to being truly foundational.
I completely agree. We are very eager to see the next version of this.
As always, we invite you to take this feedback, revise the work, and send it back to us. We look forward to seeing it again here at The Critique.
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're tackling a really critical question from the Islamic sources: the distinction between the titles Nebi, or prophet, and Resul, or messenger. And this isn't just semantics. It has huge implications for how prophetic authority is understood. The central question really is this: is obedience only required for Muhammad in his role as a Resul, the one delivering the divine message? Or does his role as Nebi, the human leader and guide, also carry its own binding authority? My position is, I think, quite clear on this. The binding legislative authority is strictly limited to the Resul function. That is, to the Quran itself. The Nebi role represents the human side, fallible, using judgment or ijtihad, and ultimately not legally binding.
And I'm going to argue from a fundamentally different starting point. I see the roles of Nebi and Resul as conceptually unified, what some sources call the Nebi Resul. So while there's a functional distinction, I don't believe it negates the overall obligation to follow the prophet's guidance and example in, all aspects of his life. To split them so cleanly risks minimizing his role as the living embodiment of the revelation.
Okay, so let's get into the material. The way I see it, the distinction is rooted in function. Nebilik is the title, the status. Rasuluk is the specific job, delivering the message, the risalat. And the key term here, itaat, or obedience. Well, in the Quran, it's consistently tied to the Rasul. The Prophet himself is told to say this. In Akaf, verse 9, he declares, and I'm paraphrasing here, I only follow what is revealed to me. Ben yanlışca bonavaye jelene uyarım. That statement, for me, places the ultimate authority not in the person of the Nebi, but strictly in the divine message he carries as the Rasul. So the standard for the community has to be the book, not independent human judgments.
I think focusing just on that legal source, you risk missing the bigger picture the Quran is painting. The text itself often links the two titles together. For instance, Musa and Ishmael are both described with the combined title Nebi Rasul. That pairing isn't accidental. It suggests the status and the duty are, fundamentally inseparable. And look at the commands given to the community. Asab 56, for example, tells believers to send blessings, salat, and support, destek, to the prophet. That reverence is directed at the Nebi, the person. It shows his status carries a weight that goes way beyond just being a delivery system for a message. I mean, the Resul delivers the law, sure, but the Nebi lives that law. And that lived example, the Aswa Hasana, must also be the model we follow. If you try to separate them, the whole structure starts to weaken.
That's a great transition, actually, because that holistic view runs right into a major piece of textual evidence. And I think it's one that functionally pulls apart the Rasul's legislative authority from the Nebi's human judgments. I'm talking, of course, about the incident with Zayd and Zainab in Ahzab 37. The context is just, it's so important here. The Nebi gives Zayd a very clear instruction: keep your wife and fear Allah. It's a direct piece of advice from the community's leader, yet what happens? Zayd divorces her. Now, if the Nebi's word was binding law, Zayd should have been in serious trouble for disobeying a command. But he isn't. He's not condemned. And why? The source material says it plainly. Çünkü Kur'an'da boşanmayı haram kılan bir ayet yoktu ondan. Because there was no verse from the Resul that made divorce forbidden. This, to me, is definitive proof that the Nebi's personal judgment is not obligatory law.
I see why you lean on that so heavily. It's a powerful legal point. But let me offer a different way to look at it. That whole incident was a very specific, unique situation. It was personal counsel that was actually setting the stage for a new divine law about adoption. It wasn't meant as a general, timeless decree. And if we look elsewhere, like in Mumtahin 12, we see the women taking a pledge, a bayat, to the Nebi. And what do they pledge? Not to disobey him in matters of ma'ruf, in things that are, recognized as good and commendable. This implies that yes, you are required to follow the Nebi's guidance in good deeds. The Zayd case just shows that a specific divine law from the Rasul hadn't been revealed on that one point yet. It doesn't mean the Nebi lacks authority. So my question back to you is, where does your hard legal line leave this moral requirement to follow the Nebi in all things good?
And that's a critical question. My line doesn't discard the moral obligation. It defines it as profound deference, as deep respect for the Nebi's judgment. But it's not a legal mandate. It's not law. The lack of divine condemnation for Zayd is the key. It preserves the principle that only the Risalat, the message, defines what is legally right and wrong. And this separation is just, it's crystallized perfectly in the same surah. Look at the different consequences for harming the Nabi versus harming the Rasul. The source calls it a muazzam farq, a huge difference. Harming the Nabi, as described in Ahzab 53, is about his personal life, like overstaying your welcome after a meal, causing him distress. It's forbidden out of respect, but there's no eternal penalty attached. Now contrast that with harming the Rasul in verse 57. That means rejecting the message, the wahi. And the consequence for that? Divine curse, lanatan, and humiliating torment forever. The penalty tells you everything about where the real non-negotiable obligation lies.
I think that reading separates them too much. They're not mutually exclusive commands. They're just different scales of offense. Of course, denying the revelation is the greatest sin. But the command to not harm the Nabi as a person still shows how sacred his position is. My point is, the Resul is Muhammad, the Nabi. You can't have one without the other. So disrespecting the Nabi's person is, by extension, disrespecting the divine trust that was placed in him. Yes, the penalty for rejecting the message is greater, but that doesn't suddenly make the Nabi's personal guidance optional. If his conduct as Nabi isn't deeply respected, how can his role as Resul possibly be accepted fully?
But the severity of the punishment itself creates the hierarchy. It tells us what is absolute and what is secondary. The Risalet is absolute. The human feelings of the Nabi, while deserving of the highest respect, are secondary to that message. And this is reflected in how the companions behaved. I'm just not convinced the Nabi's non-revealed judgments were seen as absolutely binding, because if they were, the companions wouldn't have debated him so openly. I mean, look at the Getafen negotiations during the Battle of the Trench. The Prophet makes a strategic decision, an ijtihad, to offer a tribe part of Medina's harvest to get them to leave. It's a military tactic. And the companions, Sa'd bin Mu'az and Sa'd bin Ubadah, they immediately challenge him. They ask, is this a command from Allah, or is it just your opinion? And they say, flat out, if it's just your opinion, we don't need it.
That kind of pushback is only possible if they understood that his strategic judgment as Nebi wasn't the same as a divine command from the Resul. And he accepted their objection. He withdrew the offer.
Okay, that's a strong example. But have you considered that these debates are actually defining the prophet's role as ulul amr, the authority figure among them, from Nisa 59? That verse tells you to obey the ulul amr, but it also says if you disagree, you refer the matter back to Allah and the Resul. So these debates, like Ad-Ghatafan, they show that consultation is part of his leadership as a human authority. It doesn't mean his guidance as Nebi has no spiritual weight. It just means his administrative decisions were open to discussion, which is a model of good governance. And sometimes, he didn't yield. Think of the Hudaybiyah Treaty. Everyone hated it. Umar protested vehemently. They all thought it was a disaster based on the Nebi's personal call, but he stuck with it and history proved him right. So even when his judgment was debated, it often demanded profound deference.
I think you're blurring the lines there between consultation and binding authority. At Ghatafan, the companions didn't just consult, they vetoed his plan, and he accepted it. If the Nabi's authority in that sphere was mandatory, he would have overruled them. The fact that he didn't and that they weren't rebuked for it brings me back to my main point. Only the Rasul's message is absolutely binding. The Nabi's guidance is the best human judgment possible, worthy of honor, but it's not legally final like revelation. If we don't hold that line, we risk turning every human opinion, every strategic decision into divine law, and that's a confusion we have to avoid.
I agree you have to avoid that, but I just come at it from the other direction. For me, the unity of the Nebi Resul is essential for putting the law into practice. Of course, the Quran is the sole source of law, but the Nebi is the indispensable model for how that law is lived. His actions, his administration, his life, so much of it is actually narrated in the Quran. That shows his conduct as Nebi Resul is deeply interwoven with the message. You can't just obey the Rasul's text without also following the Uswa Hasana, the beautiful example set by the Nebi. They are two sides of the same coin.
In the end, for me, the consistent evidence, from Zayd's divorce to the different penalties in Ahzab, it all confirms that binding legislative authority was located strictly in the function of the Rasul. And understanding that allows us to accept the Quran as perfect divine law, while also acknowledging the reality that the Nebi, as a human being, made judgments that could be and were questioned.
And we may continue to disagree on just how binding that authority was, but what's clear is that the material gives us a very sophisticated way to think about this. It forces us to ask where the divine message ends and where the human implementation begins. And that distinction is absolutely vital for any serious engagement with the sources.
Absolutely. Discerning the divine command from the human example, that's a challenge that remains at the very heart of this entire field of study.